what would happen is the commands were generated out of this computer program, sent out to remote tracking stations around the world, and uploaded into the satellite as it passed over each of those tracking stations. And on subcycle 9, 10, and 11, we were flying over the Soviet Union. The commands would be sent to the satellite, which had a 64 kilobit computer on board, and it would command what we call mouse farting gas jets to steer it in roll angle out to as much as 45 degrees, plus or minus 45 degrees, and it would determine when to turn the camera on. And my job was to get as many cloud-free targets covered as I could.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade
to meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was raised in Leavenworth, Kansas. I was born into a civilian family. Only my great-grandfather was a sergeant in the Army at Fort Leavenworth. He was an armed guard on the Oregon Trail. And my father moved to Leavenworth when I was 5 years old. My father was never going to spend a nickel sending me to college, and I had an uncle who was a member of the Pendergast gang, the Kansas City Mafia, that put Harry Truman in the Senate. He owned the Congressman Albert M. Cole from the 1st Congressional District of the state of Kansas. My uncle called me and said, "Robert, do you want to go to the academy?" I said, "It's free, isn't it?" He said, "Yes, it is free." I said, "Fine, I want to go. Which one do you want to go to?" Well, I was slave labor in my father's pawn shop in an army town. And you know what I thought of army people working in my father's pawn shop. Navals wore white uniforms, they had white hats. My hero was the Lone Ranger. He rode a white horse, had a white hat. The choice was simple. I chose the Naval Academy to get a free education. After 3.5 years at the Naval Academy, and I took my commissioning physical, I flunked it. The Navy said my ASAT had gotten so bad they would not give me a line commission. They would only give me a commission in the Supply Corps, stacking skivvies by the score. Now remember, I told you I went to get a free education. I never intended to make a career out of the military anyway, but I was so insulted because as a plebe at the Naval Academy, if you were asked by an upperclassman, "What's the only thing in the world lower than whale feces?" "A supply officer, sir." And so it was an insult that the Navy was going to make me a 6th-class citizen. So I asked for an interview with the Air Force liaison officer. You were considered a traitor if you got caught even talking to him. And I saw him. I said, "Colonel, will you take me?" He said, "Of course, young man." And I said, "But what will you do with me?" He didn't know he was a prophet. He said, "Son, I'm going to send you to missile school. Someday we will be in space." I graduated in June of '57. Sputnik went up in October. Gary Powers got shot down in his U-2. President Eisenhower decided we had to see behind the Iron Curtain, and he approved Weapon System 117L, which was the first of the space reconnaissance programs, and I was in on the ground floor of that.
Talk about your first assignment. You were at Lowry Air Force Base in Guided Missile School, which, from what I read, you were not all that enthralled with, but you did get to talk to a lot of pilots who had served in World War II in Korea. So how did they help prepare you for what lied ahead? Well,
that was an interesting thing that happened to me. We were dying of boredom. There were 25 classmates from the Naval Academy, 25 classmates from Hudson High, which was our name for West Point. They called us Canoe U. But we were dying of boredom because the sergeant who was our instructor was teaching us vacuum tubes and voltmeters, and our education in electronics was far beyond that. But there was a thing called the Roach Coach. At coffee break time, we would go out and have coffee and donuts, and the class after mine was the one that had these old guys who had been in World War II. Major Sullivan actually was in Hogan's Heroes, really did exist. He told these fascinating stories about escaping at night from the prisoner of war camp and going out and wreaking havoc over Germany. And Hal Keat was a navigator, flew on the Ploesti raids. Joe Del Masso was a P-38 pilot, and as a kid, the P-38 was my favorite airplane. And Major Sullivan said, "Bob, we want you to come study at our houses at night to help us get through the class without being flunked by the sergeant." And I was learning about the real Air Force. And after several nights of this, Major Sullivan said, "You need to wash back to our class so that you can protect us from the sergeant. You'll be in the class with us." We went to see Lieutenant Colonel French, the school commander. Major Sullivan said, "Lieutenant Rosenberg wants to wash back to our class." And Colonel French said, "You're dumb enough that you want to stay here an extra 2 months?" "Yes, sir, I'm learning about the real Air Force." He said, "Okay, if you're that stupid." So he assigned me. Now what happened as a result of that, 25 of my classmates ended up in the Matador Squadron in Florida. 25 second lieutenants all working for a first lieutenant. The other 24 ended up at Vandenberg in the Atlas IOC program, working for a first lieutenant. Most of them resigned after 4 years. I was not considered a second lieutenant. I was part of this class, which was the Strategic Air Command was the owner of this class that I was now in, and they were sending all of the graduates to Strategic Air Command bomber bases because the Air Force thought they were going to maintain missiles like they maintained bombers. So I got assigned to Forbes Air Force Base as a result of that, where my job was to become the line maintenance officer in an RB-47 wing. What it required was, when I went in and I saluted Lieutenant Colonel John C. Moynihan, my squadron commander, stevedore, 8th grade graduate, boxer, a real mental giant. He looked at me and he said, "Lieutenant, if you ever get anywhere in my Air Force, it's in spite of the fact that you're a panty waist, blank academy graduate. Get your rear end out on the flight line. I just fired Lieutenant Longman. You're the new line maintenance officer." I didn't know what in the heck a line maintenance officer was. I turned without saluting him. He said, "Son, you want to get ahead in my Air Force, you better play golf. Your wife better play bridge with you, and you better have your wife join the Officers' Wives Club." I never learned to play golf. We never learned to play bridge. She only became a member of the Officers' Wives Club when I was a senior officer, because raising the kids kept her from doing that. But so I went out to the flight line, and I see line maintenance officer Sergeant Beauchamp's name is on one side, blank on the other side, so I knew that's where Lieutenant Longman had just been fired. So I saluted Sergeant Beauchamp and I said, "Sergeant, sir, I'm the new line maintenance officer. What do we do here?" Old Ira came, put his arm around me, and he said, "Lieutenant, you take care of the troops and we'll take care of you." I got 2 commendation medals as a second lieutenant, believe it or not, because I took care of my troops. That was long before computers. We were responsible. I had about 350 NCOs and airmen whose job it was to maintain the bomb nav equipment, the communications equipment, the radars, all of the electronics equipment aboard the B-47s and the KC-97s. This was long before computers, but we had an outfit called MDCAU, Malfunction Data Collection and Analysis Unit, and their job was to keep records of the black boxes that failed most often during the flights. They would debrief the crews when they returned. They came to me and they said, "Hey boss, you need to let us put horsehair in the milk trucks so we follow the bombers out to the end of the runway before takeoff. And when the aircraft commander calls and says, 'My ARC 128 just crapped out,' we can grab the black box, run up, stick it in, and no late takeoffs. In those days, late takeoffs in Strategic Air Command were a sin because our job was to make sure we trained like we were going to fight. We had to survive a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. And not only did this get adopted by my wing and my division, but it also got adopted by 8th Air Force and Strategic Air Command headquarters. And so I served in that job, but then got sent TDY, temporary duty, down to Huntsville, Alabama, because Secretary of Defense Charlie Wilson had decided that any missile that flew over 1,000 miles had to be run by the Air Force instead of the Army. The Army reluctantly gave up the Jupiter program to the Air Force. And I thought that was going to be my future, operating and maintaining the Jupiter missiles. But what happened instead was I had orders to go to Italy and with the Jupiter, and those orders never got canceled. Instead, I got a new set of orders to go to Camp Cook, California, which was the name of Vandenberg before it got changed. It used to be an Army tank training base during World War II. And I called this buddy of mine, who was a military assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown. And I said, Irv, you got to get me out of this stupid assignment to Camp Cook. I'm going to Italy. He called me back a week later and he said, Robert, you are not going to Italy. I can't tell you what you're going to do, but you're going to go to Camp Cook instead. The Navy owned what today is South Vandenberg. It was Point Arguello Naval Air Station. And the captain who ran that wanted to locate the new launch pads for the Samos and Midas Atlas Aeginas in an area that the Air Force leadership did not want. And so I was given a job by Colonel Joe Cody, who was the AFB-MD Field Office Commander, Air Force Ballistic Missile Division Field Office Commander, kind of the early days of the National Reconnaissance Program, to go pick the right launch sites. And I must admit that what I did was not really kosher, but I mounted an Aegina satellite skin on a half-track with a Lockheed crew on board this truck. We would go out to different places at Vandenberg and South Vandenberg, and whenever we got to the places that the Navy wanted us to go, I would tell the Lockheed guy, I'll take over the oscilloscope, and I detuned it so that we had nothing but noise. And when we got to the places that the Air Force was interested in, I also took over from the Lockheed technician, and I made the signal the best I could make it. Score U.S. Air Force 2, Navy 0. And when Colonel Cody went to see the captain at South Vandenberg or Point Arguello, the Navy gave in to what we wanted. I was at Vandenberg for 4 years, and the last 2 years I spent about 325 days a year on temporary duty in Sunnyvale at the Lockheed factory, where we were building and testing the Aegina satellites. And in those days, it wasn't those dirty contractors and us govies. We were teammates. I was on a team called the Vandenberg test team, and we would go up to Sunnyvale to the factory. And by the way, to get into the classified area where the Aegina satellites, that we're building the Aeginas to host Samos, Midas, and the Corona reconnaissance satellite payloads. And to get into the classified areas, we would go into the head and push a button, and the toilets would revolve around, and we would go into the classified area through the toilets. But at any rate, Colonel Bill King, who was the SAMOS program director, used to always spend time in Sunnyvale when we were testing the satellites. And on one of the trips, I took Marge with me. And on that trip, we had a 6-month-old baby who cried all the way up on the trip. We didn't know he was teething. And when we got to the motel we all stayed at, the Casa Clara Motel, I said, "Sweetheart, let's go into the cafe next door and have a snack before we go to bed. Maybe the baby will quiet down while we're gone." Well, she was only willing to go because the cafe door was only about 10 feet from our motel room. We walk in, and Colonel King is sitting in there, and Second Lieutenant Rosenberg introduces his shy, quiet little bride of a year to Colonel King, and she politely chews the colonel out. "Why don't you do something intelligent like have my husband work and live up here and go TDY to Vandenberg, because he's never there. He's only there less than a couple of weeks a year. He's always up here." And after chewing Colonel King out, all he did was grin. So after 4 years, I get to go to AFIT, Air Force Institute of Technology, to get my graduate degree in aerospace engineering at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And when just before graduation, I got assigned to the Air Force Research Lab to work on materials. And I was not interested in doing that at all. I wanted to be back in the space business. So I called Colonel King, and I said, "Colonel, you may not remember me. I worked for you, not directly, but I was a member of the Vandenberg test team, and the Air Force is doing something stupid like sending me to the materials lab. And I need to get back into your business because that's what's important for our country." And he said, "Young man, I do not remember you, but boy, do I remember your wife. If you promise to keep her off my back, I'll find a job for you." For the rest of his life, even when I was working directly for General King in LA, he would always throw up his hands, "Marge, don't shoot." We had a 128 kilobit computer in the satellite control facility in Sunnyvale, California, and I received 10,000 IBM cards from an organization called the COMEREX, the Committee on Overhead Imagery Reconnaissance. This was an office under the Director of Central Intelligence, and it was chaired in those days by a guy named Roland Inlow, and it had representation from Army, Navy, Air Force, and Defense, FBI, CIA, all organizations in our country that were in the intelligence business. And those 10,000 target cards were provided to me under Roland Inlow's control, and they specified by priority. Priority 0 meant take it under any condition, whether the weather forecast is lousy or whether it's good. You take a picture, and the lowest priority was 9, and it would instruct also on the target card to get it in stereo or mono, and also look angles. If it was a particular facility that the intelligence community wanted to see from a side view or at a certain look angle or a certain time of day, and that was specified as well. And we would run these computer programs. The first one we would run was a program called Tools, Orbit Optimization by Least Squares. TRW was the computer programmer, so any program I used that began with a T was built by TRW for me. And that would determine which orbit inclination would do the best job of satisfying the requirement. And in the early days, Gambit Program 206 had gas jets that would cause the satellite to roll. And it could roll. It was flying along horizontally at 17,000 miles an hour, somewhere between 85 and 100, over 150 miles in space as the apogee. The perigee was 75 to 85 miles. And as it would fly along, my computer programs would decide what targets on each revolution could be reached best by their priority and the weather forecast, because I used the Air Force weather satellite was flying in front of us, and it would give me a forecast on what the probability of seeing the target was. Okay? And so what would happen is the commands were generated out of this computer program, sent out to remote tracking stations around the world, and uploaded into the satellite as it passed over each of those tracking stations. And on subcycle 9, 10, and 11, we were flying over the Soviet Union, and what would happen was the commands would be sent to the satellite, which had a 64 kilobit computer on board, compared to, a terabyte in your cell phone today. And it would command what we call mouse farting gas jets to steer it in roll angle out to as much as 45 degrees, plus or minus 45 degrees, and it would determine when to turn the camera on based on the information we had on where the satellite was actually in space. Then later on, Program 110, which was the replacement for 206, didn't have gas jets. It had what we call a control moment gyro, which did the corrections, and it would cause the satellite to roll much, much faster and much more capable. And my job was to get as many cloud-free targets covered as I could. What happened was, in addition to the priorities provided, I also got a top-secret SCI cable from the intelligence community telling me, by the way, we want 25% of bomber bases covered, 25% of submarine bases, 25% of tank battalions and artillery battalions and so on, because they wanted, this was indications and warning of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. Were they getting ready to go fight with us? But that had nothing to do with the priority system. And so, working together with teammates, we invented a program called Unique Requirements Key, TRW, Turkey. And what it did was, after we took the pictures, and we could then determine what the cloud cover was actually from the weather satellite, which was still flying in approximately the same orbit we were in, and provided to us from Air Weather Service, which was in Omaha at the time. And what would happen then is I would count down even priority 0 targets. I would make them priority 9s, because we had already satisfied the 25% of tank battalions, and I was not going to waste film. And I got a phone call from, on a classified phone call from Roland Inlow. Major, I don't know who you think you are, but you have no business messing with our priorities. You get on an airplane and you get back here and you explain what you are doing out of order. You have no business messing with our priorities. Well, General John Martin, who was what we in those days called the director of Program A, and there was a Program A which was run by the Air Force, a Program B which was run by CIA, and a Program C which was run by the Navy, all parts of the NRO. Well, General Martin had been the staff director of the NRO staff back in the Pentagon, and he knew all about the Comerex, and he said he was a wonderful boss's boss. He never cared about what I was doing, except his only guidance to me was, Rosie, you get as many cloud-free pictures as you can. He told me, Major, you get on an airplane, you go back to Washington, you tell them where to shove it. If they don't like what you are doing, they can get on an airplane and fly out here to Sunnyvale and spend 24 hours a day like you and your teammates are, making sure that we are getting the best coverage we can at the least cost in terms of film used. And so I got on an airplane, I flew back, and that's exactly what I said. And after they learned what the purpose of Turkey was, unanimously the intelligence community members of the Comerex all approved Turkey as the standard, except Roland Inlow, the chairman. And so Turkey became the standard for the mission.
In studying your story, it seems like you may have spent more time fighting your bureaucracy than the Soviet Union. There were frequent clashes, and you had to explain to people why you were doing things the way you were doing. You had a vision of the future that they simply didn't get. So how frustrating was that, and how did you get away with it?
Well, I don't really know how I got away with it, but what I did was I called a spade a spade. You know, to me, the colonel who ran the Gambit satellite program, he was my bus driver as far as I was concerned. And on multiple occasions, when he would give direction, for example, he said, we've got to do an emergency orbit adjust because this satellite that's cozying up to us on subcycles over the Soviet Union has got to be an anti-satellite. And I said, you are not going to do any such thing, Colonel. He said, Major, if you worked for me, I'd court-martial you. And I said, I don't work for you, I work for General King. So we went to see the general, and John Schmidt, the program director, his staff shows the general the orbit traces that are converging with us every time we fly over the Soviet Union. And he says to me, Rosie, what impact would it have on us if we did this maneuver? And I said, sir, I have been told to get a picture of the Caspian Sea monster at any cost, no matter what I had to do. This was a new hovercraft that the Soviets had, and it could fly above the water at about 20 feet above the water, and it could go over 40 miles an hour. We had nothing that could shoot back at this thing if it ever got deployed. It was so fast. And I also said, and there's a new launch scheduled at Tam, and they told me they've got to see that, whatever I have to do to the satellite. And we used to even though the limits were plus or minus 45 degrees, in order to get unique pictures, we would command the satellite to pitch up and do things beyond the 45-degree capability. And I said, if we do this emergency OA, it's going to negate any possibility of satisfying these requirements. He turned to John Schmidt and he said, John, we're not going to interfere with Rosie accomplishing the mission. You're going to not do an orbit adjust. So we went ahead, flew the mission. 3 months later, CIA came out with its report. This was the first test of the Soviet ASAT. But my job was to accomplish the mission. And I had no reports from the intelligence community at the time that there was a threat to our satellite, so I was not worried about this mysterious satellite that kept coming to closure with us. Well, when I was working in the National Security Council in the White House for President Carter, I first went over to work for President Ford under Brent Scowcroft, who was a national security advisor. And on the 20th of January, 70 members of the NSC staff got pink slips. 4 of us were asked to stay on, and 2 military and 2 CIA. And I was the Intelligence, Space, and Telecommunications White House weenie. My colleagues all thought they were very important, but I call us White House weenies. And I used to attend budget meetings with the president because Zbig Brzezinski, my boss, was too busy worrying about the president's health to attend budget meetings. And although I was not in the defense cluster, which was run by a different set of guys, I snuck GPS into the president's budget, even though it did not come over from the Air Force or DOD. And I got a phone call from Lieutenant General Ab Greenleaf, who said, "Colonel, your career is over. We have no use for that space garbage in our budget, and you stuck that in the president's budget over our objection. Your career is dead. You have come to your end." Well, I thought it was a secret that I had snuck it into the president's budget, so I called General Lou Allen, who was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who was very influential in my whole career. And I said, "General Allen, I want you to know that I'm the one who actually put GPS in President Carter's budget." He said, "Well, why are you telling me this?" And I said, "Well, General Greenleaf called and said he was unhappy that I put it in there." And he said, "Well, what did he say?" And I said, "Well, he said, the Air Force was unhappy." And General Allen said, "No, I want to know exactly what he said." I told him exactly what Greenleaf said. He called Greenleaf into his office, made the 3-star stand at attention, and said, "Ab, don't you dare ever call Colonel Rosenberg again over in the White House. He's not serving as a lackey of the Air Force. He's serving as a member of the National Security Council. And whether you like what he's recommending to the president or not, you will respect his position. If you dare ever call him again with any such nonsense, I will court-martial you." So at any rate then, after I finished working for President Carter for 3 years, I left the White House, went back to the Air Force. I ran the Air Force. I kiddingly call it the Air Force think tank, Air Force Studies and Analysis. It was the in-house RAND Corporation for General Allen. And one of the General Allen's rules was, "Rosie, you are going to be the chief iconoclast of the Air Force. You are going to do all of the studies on our future weapon systems and capabilities. But if you, before I allow you to come brief me or Secretary, or you are going to run your studies through the 4 stars whose octave are potentially goring. And if you give in to their preconceived notions and change your briefings to satisfy them, I will throw you out of your job. If, on the other hand, you warp and bias your study results to make the decisions for us, I'll also fire you." Well, so one of my first studies was on GPS. It was putting GPS on our fighter planes to, fight with the Warsaw Pact. And without GPS, we lost the air war in less than a week. With GPS, we won the air war, because with GPS, precision-guided weaponry, we could destroy the runways of all the Warsaw Pact bases and prevent their airplanes from taking off. Now, I went and briefed General Creech, who was the commander of TAC at the time, and he said, "Rosie, you are going to prevent me from getting my 40 TAC fighter wings, but I'm not going to argue with you, because I know you're trying to meet the objectives of objective analysis." At any rate, but it got put in the Air Force's budget, and what happened was General Al Slay, the commander of Systems Command, refused to put the Group A wiring in the new F-16s, and as a result, we ended up spending literally hundreds of millions of wasted taxpayers' money rebuilding the F-16 Group A wiring to incorporate GPS. But then the next year, I was a member of what we call the Air Staff Board, and Chuck Cunningham was the chairman, and the budget for GPS went up $100 million that year, which would have been quite a bit more in today's dollars. But at any rate, he said, let's get Randy Randolph down here to explain why we're wasting $100 million on this space junk. Randy Randolph was in the Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development Office, and he was Mr. Space. He came down, explained why, left the room. Chuck pounded the gavel and said, we're going to zero that out, right? It's nothing but that space garbage. I got up on that. It was a classified conference room. I stood up on my desk chair, and I yelled at all of my colleagues. I said, listen, you damn stupid fighter pilots. This is going to get in the Air Force's budget, and if you don't support the $100 million, I'm going to go up and see the chief and have him order you to put it in the budget. We compromised at $75 million. And it was guys like Jack Chain, who became later the commander of Strategic Air Command, but he was a fighter pilot. John Schad, who also became a 4-star. All buddies of mine, but they still remember, even today, me standing up and raising the roof on them. So that was just a couple of examples. But then in retirement, one of my jobs was I was asked to chair a GPS advisory board for the Air Force. And Brad Parkinson, who was the inventor of GPS, was a member of that. It was run by Institute for Defense Analysis. Kirk Lewis was the executive secretary, and I refused to call him a secretary. I insisted that Kirk was a member of the team, and we would meet at the GPS program office in LA. We would meet and have meetings with the 4-star at Space Command, and on many occasions there were disputes between me and the Air Force over the future of their operational use. They were not interested in wasting any money on a civilian capability on GPS. And I said, it's important that we establish GPS as the worldwide gold standard so that no other nation will try to compete with us. And I remember going in front of the Joint Chiefs to justify what I was proposing, and I got challenged in the meeting with the Joint Chiefs, and I just chewed all the 4-stars out. And I said, you need to understand that this system is going not just to support the military, but it's going to be a living standard for everyone in the United States, and the world will become dependent on it. And that's another example. But even more, during Afghanistan, we had 24 operational satellites evenly spaced around the Earth, but we had 6 operating spares all gathered together. And we ran a study showing what would happen if we had 20, not just 24, but 25, 26, 27, 28, using those spares instead of all stacked up together. Instead of them being up there as spares, we actually realigned the way the birds were evenly spaced around the Earth, and we came up with the answer that during Afghanistan, over 4 hours a day in the canyons of Afghanistan, we were without GPS with just 24, and the accuracy was totally degraded. And the Taliban knew this, and that's why they operated when and where over Afghanistan they knew we couldn't use GPS. So I went with Brad Parkinson. We briefed the commander of Air Force Space Command, and he said, I had always had a private meeting with the general after briefing in the conference room. He said, Rosie, this is intuitively obvious. Why aren't we doing it? And I said, because your staff is afraid that if they approve this, it will ruin their careers with a fighter pilot-led Air Force who doesn't want to waste money on this space junk. And he said, well, we're going to do it, but I want you to go brief my 3-star out at Vandenberg because he works for General Chilton, the commander of Strategic Command in Omaha. I briefed the 3-star, same question, why aren't we doing this? And I told him the same answer, and he said, Rosie, we're going to do this, but I have to go brief General Chilton because the last time I moved a satellite without his permission, he chewed me out. So on Christmas Eve, I get a back channel email saying, General Chilton asked me during the presentation, is this just another one of Rosie Rosenberg's crazy ideas, or do the warfighters really need this? And he asked about 4 questions. I answered every question in detail, and I sent it to the Air Force Space Command commander. And the brigadier general came out of the meeting, called me and said, the general says that you are very unhappy, and he wants to know, do you want to come to Colorado Springs to meet with him? I said, no, you tell the general that if he doesn't start moving those damn satellites in the next 24 hours, I'm calling my buddy Bobby Gates, the Secretary of Defense, and have him order you to start moving them. Because under Title 10, he is responsible for training and equipping the forces, not General Chilton. Well, they started moving the satellites, and both Chilton and the commander of Air Force Space Command met with the press the next day and told them they were moving them because the operational forces really needed this capability. And I wanted no credit. I was delighted that the 2 4-stars came to their senses and did what the heck we needed to do.
I think making you the chief iconoclast of the United States Air Force is probably a pretty good decision by General Allen. It seems like it yielded a lot of good results. I'm just fascinated by the GPS that you not only saw the military value in it, but the civilian value in it. I mean, we use it now to get to Grandma's house, but the reason we could send munitions down chimneys in Baghdad during the Gulf War is because people like you saw the possibility in it.
Yeah, it's a valuable system, and as a matter of fact, I'm concerned today over its terrible vulnerabilities, and it's not just its vulnerabilities as a weapon system, but all of our timing, banking, financial, everything that goes on. The timing system is universal. It used to be, that farmers would just spend millions tending the crops with watering and planting, and now farmers who use GPS in their vehicles know exactly where they have planted each seed and exactly where to water it, where to fertilize it, and it's dramatically impacted industry all over the United States and the world.
There was also a point during the Carter years where he was interested in getting rid of satellites. So that obviously would have derailed your vision for national security. So how did you work to change that plan?
Well, there were many places where I worked with President Carter on space systems. He wanted a national space policy, and I was chosen to develop presidential review memorandum to review where we were going to go in space. And one of the things that I included was an anti-satellite capability. And the Secretary what happened is President Carter signed PD 37, U.S. National Space Policy, and but this top secret addendum he also signed. Secretary of State called him and said, "You need to fire Rosie Rosenberg. He got you to approve weapons of mass destruction in space." Well, Zbig Brzezinski, my boss, just automatically approved 95% of what I recommended to the president. And he called me and he said, "Rosie, you need to put together a presentation to explain to the president what this top secret memo was all about." So I called Harold Brown, the SecDef, and I said, "I've got to go explain to the president why ASAT is in the budget, and I need you here." So I called Link Tempo Vought, and I said, "I want about 5 view graphs. I don't want an engineer near any of them. The first one is a brick flying through space with Mercury wings and a grinning face. And the second one, I want the brick smashing into a satellite. And the third one, an F-15 launching it, because that's the only way I could get the damn fighter pilots in the Air Force to support the program. Gave them a mission with their airplanes to launch it. At any rate, so and I had a full-scale mock-up of the payload, which had 36 little rockets and an IR seeker. And so Harold Brown and I go in to brief the president in the Oval Office. And I get to the second view graph, and the president sees this full-scale mock-up. And he says, "Harold, what is this?" And Brown starts describing it. He says, "Oh, we need one of these." And I said, "Boss, that's what your Secretary of State told you to fire me over. He claimed it was a weapon of mass destruction." The president said, "Oh, we need one of these. We need to have one in development so that I can persuade the Soviets they must give theirs up." So it got approved. But then also the president wanted an anti-satellite treaty with the Soviets. And he said, "Rosie, you're going to put together this treaty because we must make sure we do not militarize space." And I said, "Sir, we've already militarized space." And he said, "Your job is to do what I want, not what you think is right." So I put together an ASAT treaty which did not allow any surface-to-space, space-to-space, or space-to-surface weapons to be used. I was sure, since there was no way we could actually monitor this to guarantee it would work. And Ambassador Bob Buckheim lays the treaty on the table in Europe, and the Soviets immediately accept it. And I'm running a backstopping committee back here in the United States, and I'm saying, "Oh, this is just terrible." And the Soviet guy says, "We accept it as written as long as you accept this preamble." And the preamble said, "Nothing in the following treaty will deny either side the right to destroy pernicious satellites." Well, that made the treaty useless, right? Buckheim says to his Soviet colleague, "What's a pernicious satellite?" "Comrade, you know what a pernicious satellite is." Well, back here in the United States, we were about to launch the new KH-11 real-time photo reconnaissance satellite, and the whole community was sure the Soviets wanted to shoot that down. At any rate, for a week, the Soviets refused to describe a pernicious satellite. At the end of the week, they had a cocktail party, and the Russians always, drink too much vodka. And at this vodka party, Buckheim says, "Okay, comrade, tell me, you got to explain what's a pernicious satellite so we can negotiate." And he said, "Bob, you're going to put up a direct broadcast satellite over India, and it's going to beam down blue jeans, rock and roll, and freedom, and we cannot tolerate that inside the Soviet Union, and you will give us no choice but to destroy that." That was the end of the treaty, thank God. But ever since then, I have preached to all the leadership who will dare listen to me, do not make decisions on our space capability based on our value system, we must take into consideration what the other people who are going to sign this treaty feel about.
What role did you have in developing missile defense, if any, in your final years in uniform or in the private sector?
Well, in both cases, what happened was, as the Vice Commander-in-Chief of NORAD, of course I was concerned all the time with anything going on in space. But more importantly, in my retirement years, I got a call from Susan Eisenhower, who ran the Eisenhower Institute, and she said, "General Rosenberg, we want you to serve on a Star Wars committee that we're going to brief independent of which party wins the election. We're doing this to support both parties." And I said, "No, you need to get somebody who really understands this stuff, not me." And she said, "No, everybody says we have to have you." So I ended up going to the Eisenhower Institute, where I met General Goodpaster. Goodpaster had been Ike's specialist in NATO during the invasion. And after that, when Ike retired and he ran the Gettysburg College, Goodpaster worked for him there, and Goodpaster worked for him when Ike was the president. He was his chief advisor for military affairs. And I continued to work on supporting what has been called Star Wars by giving presentations in many places on why I felt it was important to have such a capability. And unfortunately, even today, we are far from having a capability that I felt was essential